Welcome, dear listener, to Candlelight Mysteries, where every whisper hides a truth and every shadow conceals a secret. Tonight's story is The Teapot That Never Emptied, a Miss Marple mystery set in the soft hush of St. Mary Mead. Within its hedgerows and quiet lanes, the gentle rhythm of village life hides something delicate yet dark. Tea is poured, gossip hums, and eyes glance toward the small cottage newly occupied by a polite but secretive couple. Here, Miss Marple sits by her window with her knitting, her thoughts as steady as her hands. She sees what others overlook: a movement at dusk, a glance too cautious, a teapot that never seems to empty. What begins as ordinary hospitality soon reveals the hidden strains of fear and memory. In this calm and mannered world, every smile may hide a shadow, and every silence holds a clue. And now, dear listener, we turn to Chapter 1, where our mystery properly begins. Chapter 1. Late summer settled over St. Mary Mead with a warm and steady light. Lawns held the soft marks of chairs lifted after tea. Hedges sat trimmed and prim. The church clock gave the hour with a clear and decent voice. At the edge of the village lane, the Weatherby cottage showed a newly scrubbed step and a fresh coat of cream paint. Miss Marple watched from her parlour window with knitting in her lap. Her needles moved with an old habit of patience. She noted the small van at the gate and the careful progress of trunks along the path. The new couple walked behind the men who carried their belongings. They moved with a politeness that seemed to watch itself. Mr. Ellison was tall and narrow in the shoulders. His eyes had the quick blink of a shy bird. His suit was city black, which felt too stern for the lane. Mrs. Ellison wore a pale dress and flat shoes. She had a pleasant face, though her smile rose and faded like a thought. She could not keep. Miss Marple saw the village do what it always did. Mrs. Price Ridley paused during her walk and spoke, to the boots of the van drivers rather than their faces. Miss Hartnell came out to examine the roses and gazed along the hedge like a lighthouse in calm weather. Reverend Clement lifted 2 boxes himself and blessed them with short remarks about sturdiness and providence. When the last trunk went inside, the cottage door stayed open for breeze. Miss Marple felt the little shift that comes with new people. A village is a clock, she thought. Each face is a gear, and a small new tooth can change the hour. She placed her knitting aside and crossed her garden. The path smelled of time where a heel had bruised it. Near the gate, she paused to look back at her borders. She had the habit of leaving a thing while keeping it in view. Then she went out into the lane and walked toward the cottage with the look of a person who fears to hurry politeness. Mrs. Ellison stood in the doorway with a cloth in her hands. She greeted Miss Marple with a soft voice and grateful eyes. Mr. Ellison stood just behind and thanked her for coming by. The words were correct, yet carried the calm of rehearsal. Miss Marple did not press. She offered a small tin of seed cake and wished them success with the cottage. She admired the paint and the new brackets for the hanging baskets. She noted the fine mat inside the step, with the initial E stitched in navy. Such details spoke of a ship setting sail under proper colours. They invited her to tea for another day. She accepted for the next afternoon with an easy tone. As she turned to go, she saw a teapot on a side table inside the narrow hall. It was brown and squat with a glossy lid. The pot looked old, and the handle had a tiny chip near the top curve. A small clue visited her mind then. She saw that the teapot rested on a tray, though there were no cups, no milk, and no sugar. It stood alone, as if a figure placed on a stage before the actors took their marks. She let the thought sit and walked back home in quiet steps. In the afternoon, the lane felt drowsy. A cat slid along the hedge with the care of a diplomat. Miss Marple took her knitting to the window again. She arranged her ball of wool and began a pattern she knew by heart. The village resumed its breathing. Toward evening, a boy from the grocer came down the lane on his bicycle. He brought a paper parcel to the cottage and stood with his cap in hand. Mrs. Ellison gave him a coin and a kind word. The boy looked pleased and wheeled away with a new tick in his bell. Another clue arrived with the last light. Miss Marple saw Mr. Ellison move the brown teapot from the hall table to the small parlour beyond. He handled it with more care than he used for a vase or a book. He set it down, looked at it, then shifted it again by half an inch. This was not pride in decoration, it was measurement. At supper, Miss Marple ate a thin soup and some cold beef with mustard. She sat alone and felt the old comfort of a regular plate at a regular time. She turned the day over in her mind as she folded her napkin. A new couple in a small cottage can bring nothing more than themselves. Yet people often carry a history with a handle, and that handle is always the easiest thing to see. The evening deepened into a soft navy blue. Lamps glowed behind curtains. The churchyard trees stood like patient watchmen. Miss Marple wound her clock and judged the hour by its soft tick. She considered the usual welcome that would follow for the Ellisons. A tea at the vicarage, a tray of biscuits from the school committee, and one earnest call by Mrs. Price Ridley with news shaped like advice. She thought of Mrs. Weatherby. Long gone to a married niece in Devon, the cottage had stood empty for months. Windows closed too long tend to remember what they saw last. Miss Marple believed that houses keep their own quiet minutes, and new hands have to earn their trust. Morning came clean and gold. The dew lay in a fine lace on the lawn. Miss Marple walked to the post office for stamps and a breath of talk. She met Mr. Petherick on the step and gathered from his manner that not much had happened. This is always a sign that something waits to happen. At 11 she tidied her knitting basket and set out for the Ellisons. She chose a plain hat with a neat ribbon. Clothes are not only what we wear, she thought. They are the words we speak before our mouths open. Mrs. Ellison greeted her with a warmer smile that reached her eyes this time. The small parlour smelled of beeswax and tea. Sunlight fell across the carpet in a mild pattern. The brown teapot sat on a tray beside 2 cups, a milk jug, and a bowl of sugar. The chip on the handle showed bright as a tooth. They spoke of small things first. The chimney drawer, the garden soil, the sound of the owl at night. Mr. Ellison asked about the trains to Paddington and the hour of the last evening service. He said he had once spent a little time in the country and had always meant to return. His voice kept a careful gentleness, like a person handling china in a storm. Miss Marple lifted her cup and tasted the tea. It was good and strong with a floral leaf. The milk had been warmed. The sugar crystals were small and even. A house that makes good tea does not intend to offend. Mrs. Ellison asked about the vicarage gatherings. She said she liked music and light games. She seemed to relax as she spoke of such harmless pleasures. People often settle when they believe they have found the safe topics. This is when their masks begin to wear at the edge. Miss Marple set her cup down and admired the teapot. She asked if it was old. Mrs. Ellison said it had been a wedding gift from a family friend. She looked toward her husband as she spoke, as if to ask him to confirm the past. Mr. Ellison smiled. He said the friend was fond of simple things. He added that the pot had a sturdy pour and a good balance. He spoke like a man describing a tool he trusts. Miss Marple nodded and let the remarks fold into the room. A last clue for the morning came when Mrs. Ellison rose to refill the cups. She did not lift the lid to check the level before she poured. The tea flowed as if the pot were always full. Miss Marple watched the smooth arc of liquid and kept her own face calm. The pot was heavy even after 2 rounds. Weight can be a language. They parted with polite promises. Miss Marple left the cottage with the sense that she had sat in a room where people practice being ordinary. Practice is good for music and manners. It is less good for truth. She took the longer route home along the green. Children played with a hoop. The grocer's boy tried to balance an orange on his head and failed with pleasure. The air smelled of cut grass, cool and sweet. Miss Marple felt the mild ache in her knees that came with years and found it friendly. At her gate, she saw Reverend Clement approaching with a list in his hand. He greeted her with kind eyes and asked if she would lend her presents at tea tomorrow. The new couple would be there, he said. He wished to make them feel welcome. She agreed at once, for welcome is a duty as well as a pleasure. Later, she wrote 2 notes and pressed stamps in the corner. She sat back and listened to her clock again. The day had made its shape. The next would bring a gathering and a chance to watch a room move around 2 new names. Evening slid into place like a drawer well made. Lamps lit, curtains closed. The lane fell quiet except for one soft step near the Weatherby cottage. Miss Marple lifted the edge of her blind and saw Mr. Ellison at the window. He looked out with the look of a man who counts. She let the blind fall and prepared for bed with a small prayer for all travellers who come home at last and for those who only pretend to. The following day kept its promise of fair weather. A mild breeze turned the churchyard leaves. The vicarage path wore its neat line of footprints as neighbours arrived with goodwill and cake. Reverend Clement stood at the door and bore greetings like gifts. Miss Marple came early to help with small arrangements. She placed teaspoons at even angles and checked the sugar tongs. She nudged a vase of dahlias to a kinder light. She believed that a room speaks more honestly when its details are in order. People reveal themselves against a clean background. The Ellisons arrived together and set down a small tin of biscuits. Mrs. Ellison held her handbag as if it mattered more than its contents. Mr. Ellison's cuffs were spotless, yet he wiped them with a folded handkerchief. The gesture hinted at a habit of clearing traces. Guests gathered with the usual village notes. Mrs. Price Ridley took command of a corner chair. Miss Hartnell hovered near the window. Mr. Petherick fanned himself with a receipt he had failed to forget. The air filled with talk of weather, trains, and how blackberries were not what they used to be. The first clue of the afternoon came during the pouring of tea. Mrs. Ellison accepted a cup and held it with 2 hands for warmth. Mr. Ellison declined sugar but asked for lemon. The vicarage has no lemon unless someone brings it. He produced a small twist of paper from his pocket holding a neat slice. He said it was a habit from work in town. Miss Marple marked the habit and the readiness. People who bring their own detail do not like surprises. Conversation turned toward the cottage. Mrs. Ellison said the attic was dry and useful. She mentioned old labels on beams, some with a steady hand. Mr. Ellison spoke of a fine view toward the downs if one leaned from the back dormer. He said it made a man feel taller. His voice softened as he said this, and for a moment he seemed to forget his caution. Mrs. Price Ridley asked about their previous parish. She asked in a way that sounded helpful and felt like a needle. Mrs. Ellison said they had lived in South Kensington for some years. She said it was busy and she was happy to hear owls again. Mr. Ellison smiled and agreed that quiet was a relief. The word relief sat in the room and cooled the air. Miss Marple noticed a detail on Mrs. Ellison's left wrist. There was a faint mark where a watch might have rested at a tighter setting. A person loosens a strap in a slower life or changes the watch entirely. Change leaves a circle. She brought the talk to safer ground. She praised the dahlias and asked about seed catalogues. Mrs. Ellison responded with pleasure and named a nursery in a tone that felt recent. A person will reveal their true timeline when asked about something that grows. Another clue came with the biscuits. The tin held a neat row of shortbreads, all of one size. At the bottom, a single biscuit had broken cleanly in half. Breakage at the bottom of a new tin means the tin has been opened before. A hostess who refills a tin chooses the precise place where a past meets a present. Reverend Clement suggested a small walk in the garden. People drifted out under the late sun. Bees traced their patterns over lavender. The lawn showed pale where children had played at the last fete. Mr. Ellison stood at the edge and measured the sky with his eyes in a private way. Miss Marple came beside him and mentioned the clockmaker in Much Benham who cleans carriage. Clocks without charging for conversation. Mr. Ellison answered with a polite laugh and said he admired clocks. He added that some things comfort a man by their certainty. She agreed and said she had always found that teapots also comforted by their capacity. He looked at her then with a careful pleasantness. He said a good teapot never fails a table. She nodded and said she had seen his brown pot and thought it handsome in a simple way. He thanked her and said it poured straight. The words were ordinary, yet his eyes moved as if he had placed a fence around them. Mrs. Ellison joined them and asked about the parish charity sale. She wanted to contribute, she said. Her hands, which had been calm, twisted the strap of her handbag, then smoothed it as if to erase the gesture. People do not fear charity. They fear notice. Tea drew to its gentle end. Farewells stood in small clusters by the gate. The Ellisons left with the promise to host a few ladies soon. Mrs. Price Ridley declared this a healthy sign. Miss Hartnell said she would bring her almond sponge and a firm opinion. The vicar shared a pleased glance with Miss Marple. A village breathes well when cups are washed and news is mild. Miss Marple walked home by a quiet turn. She felt the slight pressure of a pattern forming. There is a moment in knitting when the shape reveals itself to the fingers before the eyes. She had that feeling now. Not certainty, only shape. At home she opened a small drawer and took out an old notebook. She kept simple notes when the mood required. She wrote the date, the names, and 1 or 2 words. Brown teapot, lemon slice, watch mark. Tin refilled. She closed the book and placed it under a folded cloth. She had learned that written memory is a tool like any other. The evening returned with a tender blue. A soft cloud drifted over the downs and came apart in the first stars. Miss Marple took her knitting to the window and listened to the lane. Somewhere a bicycle bell rang once without cheer or alarm. She thought of the brown pot and its steady weight. She heard in memory the clear pour of tea and saw the careful half-inch of adjustment on the parlour table. A final clue arrived before she slept. There was a light in the cottage at an odd hour. Not late, but earlier than most lamps are lit in summer. It glowed in the small back room where a person might keep a desk or a cupboard. It winked out quickly, as if someone had remembered that darkness has its own manners. Miss Marple put out her lamp and lay down with a mind at ease and awake. Morning would bring the ordinary stir again. There would be eggs to boil and a short walk to the grocer. The Ellisons would continue their little acts of arrival. The village would set its clock by chimes and by the hush between them. Miss Marple would watch, not with suspicion, but with the kind interest she offered to growing things. She did not fear the new couple. She feared for them. Trouble rarely comes like thunder in a place like this. It comes like steam from a spout, steady and mild until the room grows damp and the windows mist. And someone wipes a pane and sees the shape outside. It is never a stranger by then. It is the thing one has carried along. Miss Marple drew her curtains and thought of the tea to come at the cottage. She thought of the tray in the hall and the pot moved by careful hands. She thought how people hide what they think will give them away, and how often they choose the wrong thing. She smiled slightly in the dark, and let the clock lead her into rest. Chapter Sign 2. The vicarage at St. Mary Mead stood as it always had, square and well behaved. Its windows were bright, its garden neatly clipped, its bell on the gate shining like a kept promise. The village had gathered here many times before, yet today felt gently charged. A new couple meant talk, and talk was the heartbeat of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple arrived early with a jar of marmalade wrapped in cloth. She greeted Reverend Clement and his wife with her usual grace. Inside, the air smelled of lemon polish and sponge cake. Teacups waited on the tray like pupils before the lesson. Mrs. Ellison entered a little after 4, her pale dress cool against the late sun. She smiled as though learning how. Mr. Ellison followed with a nod and a careful balance of words. They seemed pleased but uneasy, their movements slightly too measured, their glances too aware. The other guests spoke with cheerful curiosity. Mrs. Price Ridley praised the begonias and turned quickly to the newcomers. Miss Hartnell whispered about the Ellisons' London address and wondered whether their habits would suit a country life. The vicar smiled benignly over his teacup and spoke of parish matters, guiding conversation away from direct inquiry. A small clue arrived as Mrs. Clement served the first pot. When the teapot's lid rattled slightly, Mrs. Ellison flinched as if the sound were sharper than it was. Mr. Ellison steadied her hand with his own. But the touch lasted too long for comfort. Miss Marple observed without staring. She poured her tea, stirred once, and let the spoon rest. Her eyes moved from cup to cup as each was filled. She saw Mr. Ellison decline sugar and noticed how he turned his cup so that the handle faced precisely east. The action seemed instinctive, the mark of a habit tied to another table in another place. The room held its hum of small talk. Mrs. Price Ridley mentioned a story of a missing heirloom from a nearby parish. She said it had never been found, though the police had searched every piece of furniture. Mr. Ellison's hand paused mid-air, his spoon resting at an odd angle. His smile held steady, but his eyes lost focus for a second, as though following a memory. Mrs. Ellison's laugh came too quickly. She said how dreadful theft must be in a small village. Her voice held a thin note of fear dressed as politeness. Miss Marple folded the sound into her mind. The Reverend steered the conversation to the church roof repairs. He thanked Mr. Petherick for his donation and Miss Hartnell for her organising spirit. Laughter smoothed the earlier edge. Yet, even as the talk grew lighter, Miss Marple saw the Ellisons' glances meet and part like small waves over deep water. Another clue came when Mrs. Ellison reached for a biscuit. Her sleeve brushed against the edge of the tablecloth and knocked her teaspoon to the floor. She apologized softly, but when she bent to retrieve it, her eyes flicked not toward the spoon, but toward the sideboard where a silver tray gleamed. At 10, she visited the post office. Mrs. Price Ridley was there, eager to discuss the vicarage tea. She spoke in a tone of false modesty, claiming she had noticed nothing of importance while describing everything in detail. She said Mrs. Ellison's manner was too delicate for real honesty. She said Mr. Ellison seemed like a man used to secrets. Miss Marple listened kindly and made no correction. Back home, she tended her garden. The day held a damp stillness that sharpened small sounds. A bee thudded against a window pane, and the church bells struck noon. From across the hedge, she heard Mr. Ellison's voice. He was speaking low, his tone brisk. Another voice answered, quieter but strained. It was Mrs. Ellison. Miss Marple leaned to trim her roses and listened. She could not hear the words, but she caught the rhythm of urgency. There was a pause, then the faint clatter of china. The sound was followed by silence. She set down her shears and waited, but no more voices came. Later that afternoon, she saw Mrs. Ellison walking alone toward the vicarage. The younger woman carried a small package in brown paper. She held it close to her body. When she returned half an hour later, her hands were empty, and her face held the calm of someone who has decided something difficult. A small clue followed. Reverend Clement stopped by Miss Marple's garden after evening prayers. He mentioned, in his kindly, absent way, that Mrs. Ellison had dropped off a gift for the church bazaar, a silver napkin ring and a small linen cloth. Miss Marple asked whether it had initials. The vicar thought not. He said it was very clean, almost new. Miss Marple thanked him for the news. When he left, she went indoors and wrote another note in her book, Gift to Church. Not new, only polished. She added a question mark beside the line. That night, she sat by her fire and considered the village rhythm. Some people fit like threads woven in. Others lie across the pattern, smooth but separate. The Ellisons were polite, but their politeness was armor. Politeness that shields, she thought, is often built over fear. Before bed, she passed her window and saw a light at the Weatherby cottage again. It glowed steady in the room with the brown teapot. The curtain moved once, as if brushed by a hand. Then the light went out. Miss Marple drew her curtain and smiled faintly. Every mystery, she thought, begins with something simple, an object that does not belong, a sound that does not fit. In this case, it was a teapot that poured too long and eyes that watched too closely. The night air cooled the house. The village settled into sleep. Miss Marple folded her hands and whispered a small prayer for peace, though she doubted peace was quite ready to return. Chapter 33. The third morning after the vicarage, tea came bright and sharp. The air was crisp enough to make the windows gleam. Birds called from the elm outside Miss Marple's window as she arranged her breakfast tray. A pot of tea, one boiled egg, and a slice of toast sat beside her knitting. Across the lane, the Ellisons' cottage showed the usual signs of tidy life. Curtains drawn halfway, the faint sound of crockery, smoke that rose straight from the chimney. Nothing seemed amiss. Yet Miss Marple had learned long ago that peace is not always quiet. It is sometimes the sound of something held too tightly. At 10:30, a black motor car stopped by the gate. It was not a village car. The paint gleamed too richly, and the driver wore a hat too fine for local weather. He stepped out, looked once at the house number, then climbed the path with the certainty of someone who had been there before. Miss Marple, watering her herbs, saw him knock twice. Mrs. Ellison opened the door. Her expression shifted between recognition and fear. She admitted the man quickly, closing the door before the sound of greeting could escape. Miss Marple leaned on her watering can and considered the visitor. His coat was London cut, his shoes city polished. His manner said habit, not surprise. She replaced the can, dried her hands, and moved her chair to the window. Some people might have called it curiosity. She preferred to think of it as civic duty. Time passed quietly. Then came a raised voice, male stern. A softer reply followed. Then silence. A few minutes later, the front door opened again. The man stepped out quickly, his face pale and drawn. He carried no bag, though his pocket looked weighted. He left the gate ajar as he went toward the car. On the step behind him stood Mr. Ellison, his eyes narrow against the sun. He did not speak. The visitor drove away without looking back. Miss Marple reached for her notebook and wrote a simple line. Visitor, Mr. Crane, left hat on gatepost. She did not know his name, but she trusted that the village would soon supply it. It always did. Around noon, Reverend Clement passed by. He stopped for a word about the parish garden and, with mild excitement, mentioned a stranger in the lane, a man asking for Weatherby Cottage by name. Miss Marple asked his appearance. The vicar described him as respectable but hurried, with an air of business not suited to leisure. By evening, the gossip had grown legs. Mrs. Price Ridley claimed the man was a solicitor. Miss Hartnell thought he might be a brother or a wronged friend. The grocer's boy, with youthful imagination, said the man had asked whether the cottage once belonged to the Weatherby firm. None knew what that meant. Miss Marple listened to all and said nothing. That night, a hat sat forgotten on the Ellisons' gate-post. It remained there through the morning mist, a felt bowler with a dark ribbon. Miss Marple noticed that it stayed in place, though any of the village children could have taken it. Some things, she thought, even mischief fears to touch. By mid-morning the next day the hat was gone. The air in the lane felt unsettled, as if the quiet itself had turned cautious. Miss Marple paid a call at the vicarage to return a borrowed book. She found Mrs. Clement deep in plans for the bazaar. Between talk of stalls and scones, the vicar's wife mentioned that Mrs. Ellison had appeared anxious during morning prayers. Her voice had trembled on the hymns, and she had left before the blessing. Miss Marple walked home slowly, taking note of details as she passed the cottage. The curtains were partly drawn, though not evenly. The front window was open despite the chill. Through the opening she caught the scent of polish and something faintly metallic, like ink or coin. At her gate she met the postman. He held a letter marked with a London postmark. The envelope was thin and precise, its handwriting small and firm. It was addressed to Mr. Ellison. Miss Marple saw it slip through the slot and land soundlessly inside. She went indoors, poured tea, and thought of the visitor's pale face. People do not travel from London to a small village for nothing. Old stories sometimes walk back to find their missing ends. A small clue arrived that evening. The grocer's boy, full of news, told Miss Marple that he had seen Mr. Ellison at the station. The man had bought a single ticket to London but returned on the next train. He carried nothing when he left, and something when he came back, a small brown parcel wrapped in newspaper. Miss Marple thanked the boy, gave him a toffee, and made another note. Trip to London. Brown parcel. Then she waited. Patience, she believed, is not a virtue of the meek, but of the prepared. The following morning brought a surprise. Mrs. Ellison came to call. Her smile was tired but sincere. She carried the brown teapot in a basket, as though it were a companion. She said she hoped Miss Marple might help identify the maker. She claimed the stamp beneath had faded and she wished to replace the lid. Her voice fluttered slightly on the word lid. Miss Marple examined the pot with quiet care. The chip on the handle was the same. The weight was heavier than she remembered. Inside, the glaze showed a faint crack near the base. She saw the mark beneath, blurred, but legible enough to suggest Staffordshire. She said so. Mrs. Ellison thanked her and reached for the pot, but Miss Marple held it a moment longer. She turned it again and noted a faint seam along the underside of the base, as if two parts had been joined. She handed it back gently, saying only that some old teapots were made in two pieces for firing. Mrs. Ellison nodded, her relief too sudden to be entirely genuine. As she left, the younger woman said she hoped to host a small tea for the ladies soon. She smiled, but her fingers gripped the basket's handle so tightly that her knuckles paled. That evening, Miss Marple received a visit from Inspector Craddock. He greeted her with the familiar warmth of an old colleague in amateur sleuthing. He said he was in the district on a minor inquiry about a man named Crane. Miss Marple listened with polite interest. The inspector described Crane as a retired jeweller involved in a dispute over lost property from a London estate. He had traced a lead to a woman once connected to the household, now Mrs. Ellison. The inspector smiled ruefully and said it might all prove nothing, but one could not ignore the trail. Miss Marple offered tea and listened as the kettle sang. She asked whether Mr. Crane had reported any theft. The inspector said only that certain jewels had disappeared many years before, and that suspicion had rested briefly on a domestic servant who vanished soon after. When he left, Miss Marple stood at her window again. The lane lay quiet, but light showed through the Ellisons' curtain. Steady, low, and unwavering, a shape moved once across the glow. It was Mrs. Ellison, holding the brown teapot in both hands. Miss Marple folded her arms and thought of all the things people hide in plain sight. Secrets, she reflected, were rarely buried deep. Most of them simply sat on the sideboard, waiting to be poured. Chapter 4. The morning air held the sweetness of early autumn. Leaves had begun to rust in the corners of the green. Church bells marked the hour with their usual decorum, and St. Mary Mead seemed a place immune to trouble. Yet the village hummed faintly as if gossip itself had taken a deep breath. Mrs. Ellison had invited several ladies for tea. Her note had been written in a careful hand, promising homemade scones and conversation by the fire. Miss Marple received hers folded neatly, the handwriting too deliberate to be natural. She placed it beside her knitting and smiled. Invitations often say more than they mean. At 4 o'clock the guests arrived. Mrs. Price Ridley came first, punctual as Conscience. Miss Hartnell followed, humming under her breath. Reverend Clement's wife appeared with her soft composure, bringing a plate of small cakes. Miss Marple arrived last on purpose. She had learned that a late guest sees more than an early one. The Ellisons' cottage glowed with quiet order. Flowers from the garden stood in a glass bowl. A lace cloth covered the table. In the centre sat the brown teapot, freshly polished, its chipped handle turned discreetly away from view. Mrs. Ellison poured the first round with practised grace. Her hand trembled only once as she filled Miss Marple's cup. Mr. Ellison lingered near the window, pretending interest in the weather, yet his eyes moved with the pace of a man counting time. The talk began easily. Mrs. Price Ridley spoke of her new rose bush. Miss Hartnell complained about the railway noise at night. Mrs. Clement offered a recipe for seed cake that required patience and honesty, two qualities not easily combined. Miss Marple listened and nodded. Every few minutes her gaze returned to the teapot. It stood firm and proud, though steam no longer rose from its spout. She noticed that Mrs. Ellison refilled several cups without lifting the lid or reaching for more water. The pot, it seemed, poured endlessly. A small clue came with the cakes. Mrs. Price Ridley dropped her napkin, and Miss Marple bent to help. From that low angle, she saw a faint brown stain on the tablecloth just beneath the teapot's handle. A ring darker than tea, something metallic perhaps. Mrs. Ellison offered more tea. Her tone was bright, too bright. She poured again, and the scent of the brew filled the room, a deep aroma, floral and sharp. Miss Marple noticed that Mr. Ellison did not drink. His cup remained near him, untouched. Then came the faintest gasp. Miss Hartnell, mid-laugh, set her cup down quickly. Her colour drained. She pressed her hand to her mouth, then rose unsteadily. Mrs. Clement moved to her side, alarmed. "I feel quite faint," Miss Hartnell said. "Perhaps the heat." Mrs. Ellison hurried to open a window. Mr. Ellison fetched water. Miss Marple remained seated, her eyes calm. She glanced at the cups, noting which had been used, which remained full, and which were empty. Miss Hartnell's cup sat nearest the teapot. It had been poured last. Within moments, the faintness passed. Miss Hartnell insisted she was better, yet her voice held a tremor. Mrs. Clement suggested rest, and the group soon dispersed, leaving behind polite confusion and unfinished cake. As Miss Marple left the cottage, she glanced again at the teapot. The light caught its glossy surface, and for an instant she saw something pale beneath the glaze, perhaps a seam, perhaps a memory. That evening the village breathed uneasily. Word of Miss Hartnell's faintness travelled faster than common sense. The grocer's wife said she had turned blue. The postmistress swore she had heard a doctor was called. None of it was true, yet all of it felt possible. Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting untouched. She thought of the teapot, the endless pouring, and the untouched cup of Mr. Ellison. People who prepare tea do not always drink it. That, she thought, is the surest warning of all. A soft knock interrupted her. It was Reverend Clement. He looked troubled, his usual calm dimmed by concern. "My dear Miss Marple," he said, "Miss Hartnell insists she is fine, but she complains of a bitter taste after tea, and Mrs. Ellison sent word to ask if we might keep this to ourselves for fear of gossip." Miss Marple gestured to a chair. "And yet, here you are, gossiping to me," she said gently. The vicar smiled despite himself. "You see through everything." She asked him to describe the tea. He said it was strong, fragrant, and brewed in that handsome brown pot. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. She asked if he recalled the brand. He did not, only that the leaves were fine and dark. "Poison," he said reluctantly. "Do you think it possible?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Possible, yes. Likely, not yet. But I think that teapot has more in it than tea." The next morning, she visited Mrs. Ellison under the pretext of returning a borrowed book. The younger woman's hands were unsteady. She thanked Miss Marple too quickly, her smile tight as thread. "Such a dreadful incident," she said. "Poor Miss Hartnell." "I do hope she is better," Miss Marple replied that she was. Then she asked, lightly, whether the teapot had survived its day of service. Mrs. Ellison hesitated before saying it had. She claimed she had scrubbed it clean and put it away. Miss Marple nodded. Her eyes drifted toward the sideboard, where the teapot sat again, polished, patient, and too perfect. As she left, she noticed the faint scent of polish mingled with something sharper. She looked down and saw a small spill near the leg of the table, a single drop of liquid that had stained the wood. She touched it with her handkerchief and saw it darken slightly, like old ink. That afternoon, she sent a note to Inspector Craddock. It said only, "Perhaps you might enjoy tea in St. Mary Mead again. The pot is still full." That evening the village lights burned early. Curtains closed with unusual care. Mrs. Price Ridley declared she would take coffee for a fortnight. Miss Hartnell, now recovered, insisted she had only been dizzy. Miss Marple sat by her window and watched the Ellisons' house. The lamp burned steady in the parlour, and the shape of the teapot rested in its usual place. She wondered how long it would take for truth to cool enough to touch. Chapter 3. Rain came softly over St. Mary Mead. It fell in thin, steady lines that blurred the garden edges and polished the cobblestones. The air smelled of damp leaves and earth. In such weather, nothing should have felt urgent. Yet before noon, a police car stopped by the vicarage gate. Inspector Craddock stepped out, his coat dark with rain. He greeted Miss Marple on the lane with a smile that mixed fondness and fatigue. They had crossed paths before, always under similar clouds. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said. "I fear trouble prefers your parish," she smiled mildly. "Or perhaps it prefers tea." Inside the vicarage, Reverend Clement offered him a seat near the fire. The inspector accepted, his notebook already in hand. He explained that Miss Hartnell's fainting fit had reached the county office. A local doctor had reported possible contamination of the tea. Procedure demanded inquiry. Miss Marple listened quietly, her knitting bag on her lap. She noted how the inspector's tone softened when he spoke of Mrs. Ellison. "Refined," he said. "Seems the sort to faint at a shadow." "She has seen worse than shadows," Miss Marple murmured. Craddock raised a brow. "You suspect her?" Miss Marple smiled. "I never suspect, Inspector. I observe." It saves disappointment he asked what she had observed. She recounted the details without embellishment. The teapot that poured too long, the cup that remained untouched, and the nervous hands that hid composure beneath habit. Craddock made his notes. "I'll pay them a visit," he said, "though I expect nothing more than gossip, dressed as evidence." That afternoon he went to Wetherby Cottage. Miss Marple, purely by coincidence, found herself pruning her hedge nearby. The inspector was admitted quickly. The conversation inside lasted nearly an hour. When he emerged, his brow was furrowed. He joined Miss Marple by the hedge. "Odd pair," he said. "The husband insists his wife has been ill. The wife insists she is fine. Neither mentioned the visitor from London until I did." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly. "And then?" "Then Mr. Ellison said the man was an insurance agent." "A lie, of course." "I checked. There's no such firm at the address he gave." Miss Marple paused in her pruning. "People often lie about work when their true occupation is more personal." "Did the teapot appear?" Craddock frowned. "On the mantel, clean as a whistle." "I asked to see inside. Empty. Too empty." "It smelled of polish, not tea," she nodded. "And yet you'll find the smell of polish conceals more than dust." That evening, Miss Marple made her own quiet visit. She carried a basket of scones and a manner of perfect innocence. Mrs. Ellison received her kindly, though her smile flickered like a candle in draught. Miss Marple admired the flowers, asked after Miss Hartnell, and at last remarked on the trouble of having one's name mentioned to the police. Mrs. Ellison's hands stilled. "We've done nothing wrong," she said. Miss Marple's voice stayed mild. "Innocent people rarely need to say so." Mrs. Ellison's eyes filled with tears. She looked away toward the parlour. The brown teapot sat upon the shelf, its surface gleaming. "You know," Miss Marple said, "I had one just like it once. The lid cracked, and I discovered the strangest hollow between the layers. Quite a hiding place for a girl's secret note." Mrs. Ellison's lips parted, but no sound came. She clasped her hands tightly. Miss Marple reached for her basket and rose. "Do remember," she said gently, "truth cools best when poured out early." Inspector Craddock returned 2 days later. He carried a folded letter and the air of a man whose patience was thinning. He found Miss Marple in her garden, snipping herbs for supper. "I have a problem," he said. "The more I ask, the less I find." "The Ellisons are as smooth as glass." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Glass reflects, Inspector. Look too close and you see yourself," he laughed. "You sound like my sergeant after a sermon." Then his tone shifted. "We found the visitor's name. Crane, London jeweller, retired. Came here on business connected to a missing collection, rubies and small diamonds. Claims Mrs. Ellison once worked as a companion to the widow who owned them." Miss Marple set down her shears. "And the jewels were never recovered?" "Never," Craddock said. "Crane said he recognized the woman, thought he might recover the property. But he swears he left without a scene." "Ah," Miss Marple said, "but people rarely agree on what a scene is." That evening, the inspector called again on the Ellison. This time he found only Mr. Ellison at home. The man was polite, steady, and utterly unhelpful. His wife, he said, was resting. Craddock asked permission to look around. Mr. Ellison consented, smiling faintly. The inspector noted the spotless rooms, the scent of polish, the perfect order. Only the teapot remained out of place. It stood alone on the dining table, as though awaiting service. He lifted it carefully. Empty, yet it was heavier than it should have been. He replaced it without comment. Later, Craddock met Miss Marple at the vicarage. They spoke in low tones while Mrs. Clement cleared the tea things. "Heavy pot," Craddock said. "I'd wager there's a false base," Miss Marple nodded. Patience, Inspector. Tea must steep before it tells its story." He looked at her with wry affection. "You always make me feel like a schoolboy caught copying his sums." "Then perhaps," she said gently, "you should stop guessing and start observing." She told him to watch Mrs. Ellison, not her husband. "He hides what she cannot bear to hold," she said. "And she bears what he cannot hide." That night, the rain ceased. The village lay in silver quiet. In the Ellisons' cottage, a single lamp glowed behind the curtain. Miss Marple, from her window, saw a shadow cross it. 2 figures, one standing, one seated, their movements slow and strained. A teapot gleamed briefly as it was lifted, then set down again. The next morning, Inspector Craddock returned to the cottage with a warrant. Chapter 6. The morning broke clear and pale. Sunlight fell softly on St. Mary Mead, turning the dew to 1,000 quiet stars. The village, still uncertain after the visit of the inspector, began its day with cautious routine. Curtains opened, kettles sang, and yet behind the calm, something shifted like a thought that could not settle. Inspector Craddock had returned with his warrant at dawn. Word of it spread before the church bell rang 8. Miss Marple, dressed neatly and without haste, walked toward Weatherby Cottage. She did not intrude, but one learns much by being near a door. From within came the sound of drawers opened and the murmur of men at work. The inspector's voice remained low, but firm. Mrs. Ellison's tone rose once, then fell away. When the door opened, Craddock stepped out holding a small packet wrapped in paper. His face bore no triumph, only a patient weariness. He greeted Miss Marple. "You do have a talent for timing," he said. She smiled. "Timing is only habit and an early breakfast. Did you find what you came for?" He nodded toward the cottage. "A ledger and a torn letter, both hidden in the attic." "Odd place for either." "Not odd," Miss Marple replied softly. "People hide things where they believe others won't look, not where they themselves are unafraid to climb." Craddock unfolded the letter carefully. The edges were yellowed, the writing faint but clear. It spoke of a debt owed, a missing box, and a promise to return what had been taken once the right hands could be trusted. The signature read only E. The ledger, Craddock said, matches the name of a London jeweller's account. Several small withdrawals years ago, all under different initials, Miss Marple read in silence. "And the handwriting?" she asked. The inspector frowned. "Mrs. Ellison admits it's hers, but says she was writing for her former employer." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Then she lies to protect a man." "She always has," Craddock sighed. "You mean her husband?" "Or someone who became her husband through fear rather than love," Miss Marple said quietly. She walked with the inspector to the vicarage, where Reverend Clement joined them. The vicar examined the ledger and said it looked like a record of temptation more than theft. Craddock agreed, but knew the law did not measure temptation kindly. Miss Marple studied the letter again. Her eyes lingered on a flourish in the lower corner. "Do you see that loop in the E?" she asked. "It bends back upon itself." "I have seen it before." Craddock looked doubtful. "In London?" "No," she said. "At the church bazaar, on a donation tag tied to a silver candlestick." The same hand wrote both. The candlestick came from the Ellisons. The afternoon grew heavy with clouds. The inspector stayed in the village, going over statements with quiet efficiency. Mrs. Ellison remained in her cottage, silent and pale. Mr. Ellison paced like a man who had forgotten stillness. Miss Marple visited the vicarage garden. She found Reverend Clement tying roses and told him what she believed. "Each mark in the ledger," she said, "is a borrowed life. Mrs. Ellison copied another's accounts to protect the true thief." That thief was not her employer, but her husband. The vicar looked troubled. "You think she knew all along?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "She thought she could mend wrong by carrying it. But guilt, like water in a teapot, finds its way through every crack." At dusk, Inspector Craddock returned to the cottage. This time he carried neither warrant nor notebook. He asked Mr. Ellison to step outside. Mrs. Ellison followed to the doorway, her hands clasped. The inspector spoke briefly, his tone even. Mr. Ellison denied nothing, yet admitted little. When the inspector showed him the letter, he merely said, "She wrote it because I asked her to." Mrs. Ellison's voice broke. "You said it would all be over. That we'd start again." Craddock nodded once. "You started again here, yes, with a pot full of other people's history." Miss Marple, standing by the garden gate, saw the moment truth found its mark. Mr. Ellison's shoulders dropped. Mrs. Ellison turned away, pressing a hand to her eyes. Later, Craddock came to Miss Marple's cottage. He placed the letter and ledger on her table. "For your opinion only," he said. Miss Marple read once more. "You'll find the handwriting matches both signatures. She wrote for him and for herself. Perhaps to make it easier to forgive." The inspector leaned back. "The jewels? They will be in the teapot," she said simply. "People who fear the past often carry it with them, thinking it's safer near the heart." Craddock rose to leave. "You think it's still there?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that the pot has never truly emptied." When he had gone, Miss Marple sat quietly by her fire. She thought of Mrs. Ellison, her trembling hands, her kindness wrapped in secrecy. She thought, too, of the ledger's careful lines. Each figure was a heartbeat of regret. The rain returned before midnight. In the sound of it, Miss Marple heard a kind of washing clean. Yet she knew that not all stains fade. Some remain faint and stubborn, like ink pressed too long into paper. Chapter 7. Morning rose in soft gold over St. Mary Mead. The rain had cleared, leaving the hedges bright and the air smelling of earth and roses. Miss Marple sat by her window with her knitting basket at her side. Her hands moved gently, her thoughts not at all. She was waiting for something, though she would not have said what. Inspector Craddock had promised to return with the warrant's final report, but she knew before he did that the story was not finished. The Ellisons still occupied the Weatherby cottage. The curtains still moved at odd hours, and every evening the brown teapot sat on the sideboard as though guarding the silence. By mid-morning, Miss Marple took her coat and hat and set out for a walk. Her feet found their own way toward the cottage. The garden gate stood open. No sound came from inside, yet the door was ajar. She hesitated only a moment before stepping through. The parlour smelled of polish and wilted flowers. The air was still, as if the house itself were holding its breath. On the small table by the window sat the brown teapot. Sunlight touched it gently, showing a faint line near the base that most eyes would miss. Miss Marple bent slightly, her fingers brushing the chipped handle. She lifted the pot. The weight was wrong, too heavy for empty porcelain, too even for tea. She tapped it lightly. A hollow sound answered, but not from within the cavity where liquid should rest. The sound came from beneath. She smiled quietly. "Ah," she whispered. "So you really have been hiding something?" Behind her came the sound of a door. Mrs. Ellison stood there, pale and still, her hands twisting a small cloth. "You should not be here," she said softly. Miss Marple straightened, but did not move away. "Oh, my dear, I suppose not. But sometimes, when a story insists on being heard, one must follow it to its end." Mrs. Ellison's eyes filled with tears. "You don't understand," she said. "It wasn't mine to take. It was his." "I understand," Miss Marple said. "I believe you carried his sin because you thought you could lighten it. But guilt is heavier when it belongs to two." Mrs. Ellison's lips trembled. "I begged him to put them back. He said we'd start anew here, that no one would know." Miss Marple's voice stayed gentle. And yet the teapot knew. For a long moment they stood in the quiet room, the brown pot between them. The air felt heavy with the weight of unsaid things. At last, Mrs. Ellison moved forward. She lifted the teapot with shaking hands. "You were right," she whispered. "It never empties." She placed it on the table and turned the pot upside down. The false base came away with a soft click. Inside lay a small cloth pouch tied with string. Jewels gleamed faintly in the filtered light, rubies, a slender chain, and 2 rings. The air seemed to darken around their brightness. Miss Marple said nothing. She watched as Mrs. Ellison drew a trembling breath and closed the pouch again. "I kept them hidden," she said. "He couldn't bear to throw them away." "Said they were proof of something. Proof that he had once mattered." Miss Marple folded her hands. "And now they are proof of something else. That love, when mixed with fear, turns heavy as stone." Mrs. Ellison sank into a chair. "I was foolish," she said quietly. "I thought goodness was something you could build afterward, like a fence to hide what came before." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Goodness isn't built, it grows, and it grows best in open ground." Footsteps sounded at the gate. Mrs. Ellison looked up sharply. "He's back," she whispered. The door opened, and Mr. Ellison entered. His face was drawn and grey, his coat damp from travel. He stopped when he saw the two women and the open teapot on the table. "So," he said softly, "you've shown her." Mrs. Ellison rose. "It's over," she said. "You can't keep pretending." He gave a bitter smile. "Pretending? That's all we ever did." "You wanted peace." "I wanted silence." "We built both on lies." Inspector Craddock appeared in the doorway behind him. His expression was steady but not harsh. "I think, sir, we'd best finish this at the station." Mr. Ellison glanced at his wife. "I never meant harm," he said. "Only to begin again," she whispered. "We could never begin again with a secret between us." Miss Marple stood quietly. Her eyes lowered. "The past doesn't vanish, Mr. Ellison. It only waits for the right moment to speak." Craddock stepped forward. Mr. Ellison did not resist. He placed his hands before him as though surrender were merely another form of courtesy. Mrs. Ellison turned to Miss Marple. "I thought I could make it right," she said softly. "You did," Miss Marple replied. "Truth always mends more than it breaks." After they left, Miss Marple remained a while in the quiet cottage. The teapot still sat on the table, open, its secret gone. She touched the chipped handle once more. The room felt lighter, as though it had exhaled. She replaced the false base gently and closed the lid. The pot now seemed ordinary, its mystery poured out at last. As she stepped outside, the afternoon sun lay warm on the lane. Children played near the green, their laughter carrying like birdsong. Peace had returned, though it wore a thoughtful face. Miss Marple paused at her gate and looked back. She thought of all the small clues that had led here, the endless pouring, the lemon slice, the quiet fear in Mrs. Ellison's hands. Each piece had fit, not by chance, but by human nature. We hide, she thought, not what we fear others will find, but what we cannot bear to see ourselves. She smiled faintly and went inside for tea. Chapter 8. The sun lay softly across the roofs of St. Mary Mead. Morning light touched each garden hedge with gold, and the stillness felt like the long sigh of a story near its end. The Ellison cottage stood open, its curtains drawn wide for the first time in many days. Miss Marple walked the lane with her basket on her arm. She nodded to the milkman, who greeted her with new cheer. The village had returned to its proper rhythm. Yet even peace, she thought, carries a faint echo of what it replaces. At the vicarage, Reverend Clement waited by the gate. He invited her to join him and Inspector Craddock for tea in the garden. She accepted, setting her basket on the table beside the roses. The inspector looked less tired now, though the lines around his eyes told of long nights. "The case is settled," he said. "The jewels are back with their rightful owner's estate. The husband has made a full confession. We'll keep it quiet. The lady won't be charged." Miss Marple poured tea with her usual calm. "Mercy, then," she said. Craddock nodded. It seemed the decent thing. She helped us find the hiding place. Claimed she'd been trying to make him give them up for months. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the teapot before her, a simple white one borrowed from the church. Steam rose gently. "The decent thing," she repeated. "Yes, mercy often begins with quiet understanding." Reverend Clement folded his hands. "It is a sad story, but not wicked at the core. Only fear and a little pride." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Fear and pride brew together most easily. It is why tea must be poured slowly." The three sat for a while in the mild air. Bees drifted over the flowers, and a robin sang on the hedge. The village beyond carried on with its day, the baker's cart rattling by, children laughing near the green, Mrs. Price Ridley already discussing the outcome in tones of pity disguised as wisdom. A small clue remained, not to be solved, but to be kept. Miss Marple noticed that the inspector had chosen the chipped cup from the set before him. He held it lightly, careful not to spill. She smiled. "You have learned," she said, "that even a flaw can serve." He returned the smile. "I learned slowly in your parish." That evening, the air cooled and the light turned tender. Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting resting unworked in her lap. The events of the past weeks moved through her mind like the slow turning of pages. She thought of Mrs. Ellison, now staying with distant relatives, quiet but unharmed. Of Mr. Ellison, whose calm surrender had seemed almost a relief. Of the brown teapot, now empty, resting in police custody until it could be returned to its rightful place. She wondered if it had ever truly belonged to anyone. Perhaps some objects, she thought, simply choose their keepers until they are ready to be free. The clock struck 9. The village lights glowed behind their curtains. Reverend Clement's bell sounded faintly from his garden, marking the hour of peace. Miss Marple rose and made herself a cup of tea. She poured slowly, listening to the liquid settle in the cup. The simple sound pleased her. There were no secrets in this pour, only the comfort of something plain and honest. As she sipped, she recalled the first day the Ellisons had arrived, the nervous politeness, the polished manners, the teapot gleaming in the hall. She remembered thinking that peace could not be trusted until it was tested. Now, she thought, it had been tested and had found its shape again. She glanced at her knitting basket. A half-finished scarf lay within, the pattern repeating with quiet regularity. She began to knit, the needles moving like thought itself, steady, small, and sure. The rain began again, light as breath against the window pane. Somewhere down the lane, the vicar's cat mewed, and a shutter closed. All was as it should be. Miss Marple spoke softly into the room. "Every secret ends where truth begins," she said. "And truth, when gently poured, never spills." She smiled, folded her knitting and turned down the lamp. The flame flickered once and steadied. Outside, the garden glistened under the thin rain. The world at last was quiet, and so, dear listener, our story drifts onward. Shall we turn the page to the next chapter? And so, dear listener, the teapot that never emptied draws to its quiet close. The candle's flame is steady once more, its light falling softly on truth revealed. In St. Mary Mead, peace returns, and Miss Marple's knitting resumes, each stitch a reflection on the tangled hearts of humankind. Until next time, dear listener, another secret fades by candlelight,